Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. I'm SocietySucks and today I'm checking out why didn't the Boers ever unite against the British by history matters. I don't know what the Boers are, so I'm completely blind here.
When Europeans were colonizing Africa, those who already lived there had strong opinions on this, with many of them resisting incursions violently or revolting
So I'm
if
guessing
Europeans
it's
were already in control
some
of the
sort of
territory.
people from
One of the
Africa.
most famous instances of this was when the Boers
The
fought
Boers.
against British expansion in southern of the territory. One of the most famous instances of this was when the Boers fought against British expansion in southern Africa. Now you'd think that fighting against a powerful imperial opponent would require unity amongst the Boers, but instead, no. At varying times, the Boers had numerous states, of which the two main ones were the Orange Free State and the South African Republic. Now, both of these states would eventually be defeated by the British, and in 1910 they were incorporated into the Union of South Africa, and thus ceased to exist altogether. But given the fact that if the Boer states had unified, Union of South Africa, and thus ceased to
1790s to 1910. Over a century?
exist altogether.
Damn.
But given the fact that if the Boer states had unified, their pooled resources and focus likely would have been better able to resist the British, why didn't they? Why didn't the Boers unite to help maintain their independence from
Probably
London?
because they hated each other?
The first Europeans to settle in South Africa were brought there by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, in the 17th century. Within 100 years of their first settlement, the settlers there and the Dutch East India Company were in control of this territory. Now, many of those who lived there were free men, but over time the VOC brought in greater numbers of indentured servants, who, in return for the price of their travel, would have to work until said debt was paid off. However, unlike most indentured servants, even after they had worked their contract, the Dutch East India Company demanded that they had to return to work if ever needed, and that this also applied to their descendants forevermore. These now former servants didn't like these terms and so opted to just, well, leave and head away from the VOC's reach. In 1795,
that was
the parts
easy.
they'd settled declared their independence, but this wouldn't last. Not because of the VOC crushing them, but because of the British, who had opted to seize the colonies for themselves after the Dutch Republic was overthrown in a revolution earlier that year, thus becoming the Batavian Republic and promptly siding with the French. The British didn't much trust their new free farmer population, whom they promptly started referring to as Boers. And the feeling was mutual. The Boers didn't like population, whom they promptly started
Boer is Dutch for farmer. Okay.
referring to as Boers. And the feeling was mutual. The Boers didn't much care for these foreign guys turning up and declaring themselves overlords, but this state of affairs wouldn't last because in 1803 the British agreed to hand it back to the Dutch. That was until Napoleon's scheming overthrew the Batavian Republic and the British returned. But this time, even after the war was over and the Dutch were restored to independence as the larger, more powerful and British allied United Kingdom of the Netherlands, the British were there to stay. Britain's now permanent control over Cape Colony meant that changes were on the way. The first of these was that the British would soon be importing their own people, which upset those already living there. The real problem, though, came from the ideas that these settlers held. Most notably, a real disliking of slavery, which was very widespread throughout the colony. In the 1820s, Britain mandated the use of English instead of Dutch in the colony, and in the 1830s, it also abolished the slave trade, which led to many of the Boers heading out and away from British control. They took their slaves with them, by the way. Throughout the rest of the 19th century, Britain gave greater and greater autonomy to Cape Colony, whereas those who had made for the exit found in many of their own settlements and states beyond British authority. Few of these actually amounted to much, and the two that really mattered were the South African Republic, also known as the ZAR, which Britain recognised in 1852, and the Orange Free State, which Britain had wanted but realised that keeping it would be too hard and so recognised its independence too in 1854. There was also, briefly, the Natalia Republic, but this was on the coast and the British wouldn't tolerate the Boers having access to the sea, and so they ended it swiftly. Now, there were some Boers that wanted unification, but there was a spanner in the works. The United Kingdom, obviously, which had made it clear that they recognised the independence of two separate states with defined borders, and if they ever unified, that recognition would thus be void, meaning that Britain would then be free to decide if it wished to allow Boer independence to continue. This didn't stop some from forcing the issue. The South African Republic's president, Martinus Pretorius, pressed for the two states to unite, but he was ultimately told no. Unhappy with that answer, Pretorius opted to launch a small invasion into the Orange Free State, hoping that the Boers living there would feel the same. They did not, and in fact, there was some back home that threatened civil war if he continued. So, better luck next time. Now, in spite of him invading the Orange Free State, the people living there elected him to be their president in 1860, and he tried yet again to unify the two. This set off alarm bells in both states, and after 6 months, Pretorius was forced to resign one of his offices, and he chose to stay with the Orange Free State. Over the following decades, the states expanded somewhat, but importantly in 1867, diamonds were discovered here in these lands which were also claimed by the two republics. People from all over the world flocked to mine them, and so, to prevent conflict, the two declared the creation of a shared government in the region. However, this didn't work very well.
That's not gonna go well.
During the breakdown of order, the two governments and those who lived in the region agreed to arbitration in 1871, and the only power that they could turn to was Britain. The British oversaw a joint government for a couple of years before just declaring that it was all a British colony and the diamonds were actually theirs. This expansion was part of a push for consolidation across the British Empire during the 1860s and 1870s, and London had its sights firmly set on the Boers and trying to bring them back into the fold.
Not surprising.
Now, the British had wanted to at least try to maintain some positive relations with their colony's neighbours, whereas the Boers openly didn't like them and conflict was common, which led to the South African Republic essentially bankrupting itself. In this, the British saw an opportunity. They argued that
Take
the
them
Boers'
over
conflict
now.
with their neighbours could damage British interests in the area, and that the ZAR's poor finances and past expansionism would put it at risk of conquest by either the Zulus or even the Germans to the north. As such, in 1877, the British declared its annexation and renamed it Transvaal Colony, which, as you'll imagine, went down pretty poorly. The Boers initially resisted passively and tried to convince the British to leave diplomatically. This didn't work.
That's not going to work.
That's not how empires are built, and after 3 years of politely asking, the Boers chose violence instead. The British were not prepared for this war and the Boers' use of guerrilla tactics, and so casualties were extremely high. The cost of maintaining British
Guerrilla tactics are the worst for anybody who's trying to take over a country. Obviously, with time, you will almost certainly destroy the rebellion. However, actually getting to that point will take quite a long time because guerrilla warfare is much different from, regular combat. Regular war.
British control in the region was seen as far too great for what was ultimately quite a poor country, and that committing more troops just simply would never be worth it unless they were to, hypothetically, discover a massive gold mine there or something. And with that, the British...
I'm guessing that's what happened.
It was agreed that British troops would leave on the condition that Transvaal remain a part of the British Empire, with self-rule in all things except for foreign policy. To the south, the Orange Free State viewed all of this with suspicion. They had a feeling that the British wanted control over them, mostly because they had constantly been asking if they wanted to join Cape Colony. However, they relied on Britain for trade and investment and so wanted no part in the uprising to their north. As such, they did nothing to help the ZAR, which didn't improve their relations with their cousins to the north but did make the British quite happy. Over the next decade, both states continued along with the Orange Free State economically.
If 90% of your trade is with the British, you may as well just take the next step and let them control you. That sounds bad, but the British could completely cut them off from all trade if they so desired. And I'm sure the British will do that once they decide enough is enough, time to take them over.
Flourishing, whereas Transvaal, which was once again the South African Republic, was struggling financially. These struggles would come to an end when a massive gold mine was discovered just south of Pretoria. Now, the Brits who lived in Cape Town were fond of money, and they, alongside many others, flooded into the country to seek their fortune. And when the British got there, they demanded the same rights as ZAR citizens, which was refused.
Ooh.
As such, they cried about it to the
and now the British have a good reason to invade.
It was now financially viable. At this point, the London government didn't quite know what to do. However, Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of Cape Colony, hatched a plan to just invade and take over the gold mining region for himself. I mean Britain.
Oh, just that?
Britain, not for his own financial
Go
gain,
for the
that
whole
is.
thing!
Patriotism. The plan was that a Cape Colony militia would make a beeline for Johannesburg, where the British there would inevitably rise up against the Boers and secure the supply of gold for Cape Colony. It didn't go well, no one rose up, and the leaders were caught. This damaged relations, and the Boers, now worried about what Britain was going to do,
Nothing ever seems to go well here.
Which upset the British, who feared German expansion. The British built up forces along the border, and the South African president, Paul Kruger, made an alliance with the Orange Free State. In 1899, they opted to launch a preemptive strike on the British forces that were building up in the area. This went well for them, and the British had to withdraw, and the Boers laid siege to the neighbouring cities and settlements. London's response to this was not positive, and the British increased the number of soldiers in Cape Colony there by over tenfold. The Boers, with their modern weaponry, attempted to fight the British on equal terms, and this went poorly. Guerrilla tactics were still effective, but the British occupied the cities and also introduced the new method of getting the Boers to surrender: camps. The camps were designed to demoralise the Boers by taking civilians, mostly women and children, and concentrating them behind British lines. And often these people were split up from their family and friends and sent far away, sometimes overseas, to make reconciliation after the war near impossible. The camps were known to be hotbeds of disease, and conditions there were horrendous. But that only helped the British in convincing the Boers to end their fight. This, combined with the scorched earth tactics and the sheer number...
If you make your enemy suffer enough, eventually they'll have to give up because they won't have another choice. It's either you give up or face total annihilation.
of British troops available made it clear that the war was unwinnable. The leaders of the Orange Free State wanted to continue the war, but they knew that they couldn't fight on their own. And so in 1902, when the South African Republic made it clear that they couldn't fight on, they collectively surrendered. In the following peace treaty, the two states would become British colonies and the British settlers there would gain the right to vote. And in return, no Boers would be prosecuted for taking up arms, and they guaranteed the continued use of Dutch in the region. And the two colonies would be merged into South Africa in 1910, which meant the end of the last independent or even semi-independent Boer states.
I thought the Boers would have been some sort of native African tribe, but no, they were just descendants of settlers from mainly the Netherlands. And the reason they didn't unite was because a lot of them simply did not want to unite. The people didn't want it, it didn't happen. Probably would have helped them to keep their independence a little bit longer if they did, but it doesn't really matter, does it? This happened over 100 years ago. It's over, it's done. All the people who were part of this are dead. It's history. Does it have some sort of impact on the people who live there currently? Maybe. I don't know. And I don't really care enough to look it up because it doesn't matter to me. Due to my lack of knowledge, I really just don't have much to say on the subject, so that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a like. If you want to see more reactions, check out this video right here. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.